The case of David Reimer is a complicated one. Throughout his short life, he was known by 3 different names: Bruce, Brenda, and finally, David. His first name, Bruce, was the one given to him at birth. The second, Brenda, was the name given to him after a botched circumcision as an infant that led his parents to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, to meet with famed sexologist Dr. John Money. Worried that the irreparable damage to young Bruce's genitals would cause issues for him as an adult, Money offered the Reimers another option: have doctors perform sex reassignment surgery on Bruce and raise him as a girl. Money believed that a person's gender identity was a learned thing, and, moreover, that they could be taught to identify differently than their biological sex. When the Reimers explained their predicament, it seemed as if the perfect opportunity to test this theory had fallen right into Money's lap. So the Reimers followed his suggestion. Bruce underwent sex reassignment surgery at a young age, and the Reimers began calling their child Brenda, providing Brenda with estrogen supplements and encouraging more traditionally feminine behaviors. However, the truth became increasingly more difficult to hide as Brenda grew up, and eventually, when they were 14, their parents told them the truth. It was then that Brenda made the life-changing decision to live as a male, and chose his third and final name, David. Sadly, however, even with this new name, David wouldn't last long. Money had declared his experiment to be a success, but the reality was the exact opposite. David Reimer had never felt comfortable as Brenda, and even after he learned the truth and embraced who he truly was, the damage was done, and the story, unfortunately, ended in tragedy. You're listening to History Uncovered, brought to you by the digital publisher All That's Interesting, where we explore the uncharted corners of the natural world and the world past. I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Austin Harvey.
And I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Kalina Fraga.
Today, we're exploring the tragic story of David Reimer. How much do you know about this from ahead of time? Have you heard of this before, or written anything on the site about it, or?
I think one of the very first articles I ever freelance edited for this site was this article.
Oh,
but
really?
it was years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Okay,
when it was pitched that we would do this, I was like, oh yeah, I remember that story because I'd never heard of him before.
Yeah, because this came up when I was working on a post about psychological experiments, and I was so captivated by this story for what it is, but also how it can tie into the modern day discussion around gender and sex identity and just what that entails. And yeah, kind of a weird parallel.
It's a lot there.
Yeah, not to beat around the bush too much here, but it's going to get a little complicated with the names and the pronouns as well. So I'm going to try my best to keep it what it should be.
Yeah.
So David Reimer, born on August 22nd, 1965 to Janet and Ron Reimer. They were a rural teenage couple from Winnipeg, Canada. They actually had 2 sons named Bruce and Brian. Bruce would later go on to become David.
Mm-hmm. And they were twins.
They were twin brothers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Janet and Ron, just a little background on them. They were Mennonites, or at least of Mennonite descent, and they just married 8 months prior to this.
I think they were really young too, weren't they?
Yeah, they were a young couple, just married for less than a year. They married the December of 1964.
Wow.
So, yeah, they were not, not that they were unprepared to be parents, because I, as far as I'm aware, they wanted to have children, but they were maybe a bit in over their heads for what this would end up being.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, both the boys, Bruce and Brian, they're born perfectly fine, but a couple months later, about 6 months after they were born, doctors noticed that both the boys were having trouble urinating, and they diagnosed them with phimosis, which is just a condition that prevents foreskin from retracting, which obviously causes urination issues.
Mm-hmm.
So 2 months after that,
doctors said, hey, maybe the solution to this is to circumcise your children. And Janet and Ron said, okay. And they took the boys in. The doctors took Bruce in first. Doctor was named Jean-Marie Huot. Huot? One of those two has got to be right.
Huot?
It seems French Canadian. Jean-Marie Huot. Yeah. Went with this really bizarre, unconventional method of circumcision, which was electrocauterization. Basically just like electrically burning the foreskin off.
Yikes.
I don't know why that decision was made.
I don't think the parents knew that was going to happen either. I think they were really surprised.
Know. Yeah, that was just the doctor's order on that one. It's a really strange decision to make.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure I know nothing about this procedure, but maybe because the babies were like older, they thought it would be better.
Maybe. I couldn't find any quote or anything from the actual doctor saying, oh yeah, this is why I decided to do it this way. And I'm sure that they didn't want to speak on it because the surgery went horribly wrong and resulted in permanent damage beyond surgical repair to Bruce's penis. And they obviously, Janet and Ron at that point were like not going to have Brian go in and undergo the same procedure.
Right.
And the kind of bitter irony to that is then that Brian's phimosis cleared away without any need for surgery.
Right. Yeah. That's kind of a crazy part. They just did nothing. It would have been okay.
Right. So Brian was fine. Bruce was now damaged beyond repair. And then Janet and Ron Reimer were basically faced with this other issue of, okay, well, our son is now, I don't want to say disfigured, but effectively disfigured for life. So they were worried about how that could impact Bruce's future happiness, whether or not he'd be able to function sexually as an adult. And around this same time, this American psychologist / sexologist, Dr. John Money, was kind of making a name for himself in the field of sex research. Money and endocrinologist Claude Midgen, they worked together. They established the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic. John Money was the guy who first coined the terms gender role and sexual orientation, which replaced the outdated term sexual preference. He was kind of one of like the first people to really argue sexual attraction is not a choice. It's not a preference. It's just what it is. It's your orientation.
I think he's one of the most interesting parts of this story because I think. I mean, he small spoiler because it's a bit of a villain in this story, but he was in his day like seen as sort of like a really brilliant. He wasn't like this hokey doctor who, these terms, gender role, gender identity, were like we still use them today, and they've shaped our understanding. Yeah,
they were very groundbreaking for their time because I mean that was however many stories of people who were in the closet because people viewed being gay as a choice and didn't understand how that worked. Definitely ahead of his time in many ways, and then very controversial in many other ways.
Ironically, he was ahead of his time when it came to like trans people, because he was like, if you're someone who believes strongly that you're a different gender, then he was like, I believe that, I believe you, and that was rare at the time.
Yeah, I know a lot of his early studies also focused on people who were intersex more so than trans. Again, a little bit of a spoiler for where the story's going. The interesting thing about what happened in the Reimer situation was effectively him trying to prove that you can teach gender identity to somebody. You can enforce a gender identity on somebody, and he was dramatically proven wrong in that instance.
Nature versus nurture, and like gender roles are taught by society and are separate from your internal gender identity.
Yeah, right. And he also kind of drew that division line between what gender is and what sex is, which is that's still an ongoing conversation. Almost 60 years later. So his research, his early work, I think is commendable. But this story, yeah, as you said, he is kind of the villain in this story.
Yes.
The Reimers ended up writing him and basically begging him for help because they didn't know who else to turn to. And again, he was making such a big name for himself in the field of, I don't know how do you, gender psychology.
Yeah. Sexology, is that a term?
They call him a sexologist, but I don't know if that's technically medically accurate or not. But
I mean, the parents that just saw him on TV and they were like, oh my God, he might be the solution we're looking for, right?
Yeah, and surprisingly, he actually did respond to them. Maybe not surprisingly, but yeah, he responded and basically was like, yeah, let me meet with you. Let's talk. Let's figure out what we can do about this. And so they went... they came to America to meet with him, and his suggestion was to have baby Bruce undergo sex reassignment surgery, and then to raise him as a girl, rename him Brenda, and provide him hormone treatments, and basically see what happened, whether or not they could convince their son that he was their daughter.
Right. I mean, the idea, I guess, was that he thought the child would be happier as a girl.
Right.
Given the damage that had been done. So
yeah. And I think
that was the motivation.
He thought because of the age, because Bruce was less than a year old, he was of the opinion that you didn't really start to like create an identity for yourself until you were about like 2 years old.
Right.
So anything up until that point, if you're able to do this surgery enough or early enough, if you're able to convince, or what's the word I'm looking for? If you're able to like plant those seeds early enough, then it shouldn't matter later on.
Right, because he thought it all came from outside influences.
Right. Right. The one thing I thought was really interesting too was like, so they had Bruce undergo an orchiectomy, which removed his testicles, but then John Money was also suggesting that they undergo surgery to create an artificial vagina, and the Reimers actually refused that surgery. I don't know why, but just an interesting note there.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah. And then so they also worked out an agreement with John Money that they would regularly meet with him and bring in Brian and Brenda so that he could observe the way each of them were growing up and see what differences there were, what similarities there were, whether or not his experiment effectively was going to be successful.
Yeah, it seemed like a perfect test case to him to have twins and have one of them, twin boys, and one of them raised female and one raised male. Yeah.
To be fair to him, it wasn't that unethical of an idea. I think it's like easy to look back now with some context and say, it's not like he took two twin baby boys and then they were both not having an issue and then made this surgery happen. Like the parents were already looking for this solution to a problem that they were worried about.
Yeah.
So it's not entirely like villainous in that regard.
Right. I was reading his obituary in the New York Times, and another doctor said, given what the field knew at the time, Money made the right call about what to do. It's easy in hindsight to say it was wrong, but I would have done the same thing. So yeah, you're right. He had his own ideas, obviously, but he was also kind of working within this, within his like era.
Yeah. And some of his methodology was bizarre and weird, which we'll get into in a bit. But yeah, I don't entirely blame his way of thinking here, especially when you consider how new all of this was at the time and how much our understanding of it changes every day now still.
Right.
Skipping ahead a little bit. So John Money met with them basically up until they were about 12 or 14, early teenage years. So from the time they were infants till then, they were regularly meeting with him. And then he would later go on to publish a report on the Reimer twins in which he declared his experiment a complete success, writing, quote, that Brenda was certainly the more dominant of the twins and much neater than Brian. He said the girl already preferred dresses to pants, enjoying her hair in ribbons, bracelets, and frilly blouses, and loved being her daddy's little sweetheart. Throughout childhood, her stubbornness and the abundant physical energy she shares with her twin brother and expends freely have made her a tomboyish girl, but a girl nonetheless. And then it was very shortly after that he was basically proven completely wrong. But before we get to that, some of the methods he went over, some of the criticisms levied against him, I guess, as Brenda, Reimer was raised under the, quote, optimum gender rearing model, which is very common for sex and gender socialization in intersex youth, but it has been criticized as sexist and for enforcing an arbitrary gender binary, which, again, maybe speaks more to the times than anything else.
Do you know any more what that means exactly, the optimum gender rearing model? Like the way Money was talking about wearing her hair in ribbons and bracelets and frilly blouses. Frilly blouses. If that's what that means.
Researchers sought to maximize intersex children's potential for a quote-unquote normal gender identity by trying to make each child's body and upbringing as consistent as possible. So basically, they would make young children or children who were born intersex, they would quote-unquote normalize them with surgery. Mm-hmm. So that would be reducing the size of a clitoris, creating a vagina, moving a working urethra, removing healthy organs that make sex hormones, basically operating on young children to not have them grow up intersex, but to conform them to one of two established, at the time, sexes, and then reinforcing that behavior throughout the life. So sort of what John Money was doing with David Reimer, but more so like for intersex children.
Mm-hmm. So basically making sure their physical body fits some
our idea
paradigm,
of
and then
male or female, or the general idea at the time of male or female.
I see. And then raising them that way. Got it.
Yeah. So not allowing for intersex youth.
Yeah.
Because that would be more difficult to deal with, I guess.
But then things got weird with Money.
Yeah. So that's more of a general criticism. Again, I think kind of just indicative of the time, like male, female, intersex, trans was all it wasn't talked about at the time. It was all very hush hush. But yeah, so some of the other methods are a little harder to defend and contextualize looking back.
And these are things that Bruce David and his brother claimed.
David and Brian,
later. Yeah, David and Brian claimed later on, Yeah. David and Brian would both later say that when they turned 6, John Money began showing them pornography and then forcing them to rehearse sexual acts. Oof.
According to a biography of David Reimer written by John Colapinto, John Money would have David get down on all fours and make Brian come up behind him and place his crotch against his brother's buttocks.
Oh my God. It's like wrong on so many levels. It's like they're brothers,
right?
Or, twins, and then children, and he's in a position of power. Just right. Bad on every angle. It's bad.
That's what I mean. Like, I don't understand the justification he made for this, but then that's not an of the times thing. That's just making children act out sexual acts.
Well, and showing them pornography.
Right. That doesn't have anything to do with gender identity.
Yeah. It just seems like they would be at 6, just too young to even really understand what they were seeing.
Right. I mean, they probably... How old are you now when you learn about sex? 12, maybe?
It depends, I guess.
I don't know. They taught it in my school in 6th grade. They introduced it, and then we comprehensively dove into it in high school. I know that's not the case everywhere, but
Yeah. Sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but I've heard like stories about what sex ed, you know, what it is in some places, and it's like not,
or
it's
what
just
it
very
isn't.
silly.
Yeah.
What it isn't, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't even think at 6 you have the capability to comprehend what sex even is. So whatever.
Yeah. It's hard to defend. I mean, it's like, it feels impossible to defend. And I wonder if this was out of some, I don't know, very unmedical things he was doing, or if he had some sort of justification in his head that like this would.
I think the idea was that he always put David in the female position.
Uh-huh.
So like there's another instance here. Money had David lay down with his legs spread and then put Brian on top of him. So Brian enacting the traditional male role with David acting out the traditional. I'm trying to say this in a way that's like is not misogynistic as possible.
Yeah.
He did take photographs of them in these positions on at least one occasion, which is a problem.
Yeah, really disturbing. Super disturbing.
Yeah, and then David and Brian both later said that when their parents were around, Dr. Money would act very like mild-mannered and calm. And then every time they left and he was alone with the kids, he would just be like nasty and yelling and really like ill-tempered and controlling. And then it's just everything just keeps getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah,
he
really.
would also make them strip naked for quote unquote genital inspections, where he would make them inspect each other's genitals and then yell at them if they didn't.
Man.
Which we're crossing into really dangerous territory now.
Yeah, crossing a lot of lines.
Yeah.
I wonder if other patients of his ever came out with anything. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I don't know either. It'd be something interesting to look into because I can't imagine, just given the nature of his work, that these were the only 2 kids who ever felt like he crossed a line.
Right. But David's case is so rare that it could have been
right
a one-off type thing. If he worked with like adults, for example, or I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I know he did a lot of work with like intersex children, but I don't know if it would have required him to do the same degree of like intimate study.
Right. And also he had like a stake in this because he wanted to prove prove his theory, right? That this was a nature or nurture, not nature thing. Yeah.
That you could teach somebody to be one gender.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Here is the little statement of his that I found that is his way of rationalizing it. He said that, quote, childhood sexual rehearsal play at thrusting movements and copulation was important for a healthy adult gender identity. I don't know if I agree with that.
Well, I could see how that could be true, but it seems like an adult shouldn't be like involved in that.
Right. And also
like kids do things.
Twin siblings.
Whatever. Yeah. But to have someone telling you what to do and showing you things and asking you to like, or yelling at you to be in certain positions.
Right.
That part seems wrong.
Yeah. I mean, it's natural for kids to be curious and to, I hate talking about this. It's natural for kids to be curious and to like explore their own bodies and whatever. That's life. But yeah, you're right. It's another thing to have it be conducted by another outside adult influence.
Yeah. Right. Especially someone who's like a doctor and, you know, he has such power over them.
Right.
And not much they could do to resist.
And then he's yelling at them the whole time too. So it's not like no kid likes to get yelled at. It's not.
Yeah. Well, you're so young. You're starting. They meet Money when they're like 1 or 2.
Right.
And then he's just, you don't have the tools to push back against that at that age.
Right. And their parents were young too. So it's not like they were but they were influenced very easily by him.
Yeah, absolutely. This big, important doctor, you know, he's going to save your child.
Right. And if that's what you think. And then again, they're not seeing most of this either. They're just kind of dropping the kids off.
Yeah.
Which I think a lot of people like retroactively blamed the parents for a lot of this. And I don't, because of the times and because of them being young and like They just wanted to do what they thought was best, and it just happened to not work out that way.
I think parents today, you trusted a doctor, someone who's, you believe knows more than you and is doing the right thing. I think most people would easily trust that and not question it.
Right. Yeah. Naturally, both David and Brian later said that they were traumatized by this quote unquote therapy that they underwent. And then the other thing I think makes a lot of sense in it, but it's a really interesting part of the story, is just the effect that this lie effectively, right, was having on the rest of the family, because the parents felt horribly guilty about the fact that they were hiding the truth of like, hey, you were actually born our son. They're hiding that from both their sons. And then like it caused like problems for all of them. Like, the parents get divorced, or no, wait, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself.
Well, I mean, David was like really depressed and like horrified, and he was reacting in a way as a young child. He was rebelling against this female gender.
This imposed gender. He even as a young child, like he was pushing back against it. He felt like it was wrong. Right. Yeah. I mean, even in his report, John Money described, quote, Brenda as tomboyish. And I know David experienced a lot of bullying at school because as a girl, he had very masculine features and characteristics and traits that obviously led to bullying back in 1970s elementary America.
Yeah. And didn't they try to put him in a dress and he like tore it off or something?
Yeah, there were a lot of instances of that. Like, that's what I mean. The report was just blatantly lying. It was like, oh, she shows a fondness for dresses and is very much likes being daddy's little girl. And it's just like, that's just not true. You have this kid who's like horribly depressed, doesn't feel comfortable in the skin they're being put in. And so when they were 14 or when they were 13, David told their parents that he would kill himself if they took him to see John Money again, because he hated going to the therapy so badly.
Yeah. I think when your 13-year-old child tells you that, that's something most parents pay attention to, and they did.
Yeah. And then a year later, they told their children the truth. And from what I read, that was just like a moment where everything clicked for David, where he was like, oh my, well, that makes so much sense that I don't feel comfortable in dresses. That's why I don't like want to do all these like traditionally girly things that like I'm being told I have to do.
Yeah, he had this angst, and then suddenly there was like a reason why. It wasn't him, it was this. And how strange it must be to be someone who grew up the way he did, and then have your parents tell you that you were living in sort of a constructed world. Right.
And I think that's where that optimum gender rearing model starts to really play into this a lot too, because it's so nuanced. If you're pushing all of these like traditionally feminine behaviors and things on a child, regardless of that child's gender, and they just straight up don't like it. It's like, I don't like playing with dolls, but you have to play with dolls because you're a girl. Or like, I want to play baseball. No, only boys play baseball. It's like, one, from a modern perspective, we know that's just not true. Like, obviously, girls and boys can enjoy sports just as much.
Yeah.
Pink doesn't necessarily mean that you're a girl because, like, it's just a color. But yeah, it was all of those, like, ideas of the time that we have to, like, really... So it's not even so much that David was being exposed to, like, feminine things. I think a lot of it was just being exposed to things that he didn't enjoy, and probably discouraged from pursuing things that would have made him happier, regardless of his gender.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure. Yeah.
Like, girls can wear pants, but you couldn't in that day and time.
It's like, it's almost like the twins who one's a boy and one's a girl, and the girl's always told, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. But for David, I think it was an even stronger thing because... Yeah.
Any traditionally male characteristics or interests he would have shown
were discouraged.
Right. Because it was like the construction of the lie was so faulty, and like all it took was like that one strong gust of wind to blow it over. And so like, any masculine behaviors that came out are like, again, speaking of the times, not my opinion. But any of those things that he would have shown, they were like, no, we got to stifle that, because if all of a sudden you start to connect with these boyish things, well, that might bring the walls crumbling down, and you might realize we've been lying to you.
Yeah, and I'm sure for his parents, there was a lot of like guilt and anxiety about that. So of course they would react strongly toward him, any inclination of his to like try to be more traditionally masculine. Yeah,
I mean, I know the parents, I want to say the dad became an alcoholic.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, like it, like definitely like, and understandably, because
there's all this, the whole family, like you said, was sort of infected by
stress and anxiety and
situation.
And Brian was really messed up by all of this too, and not even because he was in on the lie, but just because he was also exposed to this weird experimental therapy of like being forced to do all this stuff with his twin sister.
Yeah. Right.
And then finding out that his twin sister is his twin brother.
Right. When you're 13. And that's a very like tender age as well for things like that to happen. That's definitely an age where things like that really stick.
Right. So, I mean, I can imagine. I know like Brian like became like a horrible drug addict later in life, and died in 2002 after overdosing on antidepressants. And David eventually at 14, after finding all this out, decided to go by the name David. Later underwent surgery to reverse the sex assignment, decided to live as a man. And it seemed like maybe this was going in like a happier direction, because he found love, married a woman named Jane Fontaine. She had 3 children. He adopted them. He was finally allowed to actually explore the hobbies and interests that he had always wanted to, but had been discouraged from, like camping and fishing and antiques, coin collecting. All of these things that, again, we were saying like were probably suppressed because they weren't seen as feminine.
Right.
And now later in life, he's able to like finally do all these things.
Yeah.
But the unfortunate thing is that it sadly didn't work out. Jane and David eventually divorced. 2 days after Jane told him she wanted to divorce, he drove to a grocery store parking lot, parked his car, and shot himself in the head with a sawed-off shotgun at 38 years old. So
yeah, horrible ending to the whole.
Yeah, it's story. Really, really tragic.
Yeah, and also like sadly not totally unexpected, just given all the trauma he suffered in his life. Yeah,
because it's not even. I mean, we're talking over a decade of being told you're something you don't feel like you are. Then finding out that your parents and this doctor have been lying to you. And then also just the trauma of like the therapy itself and the weirdness of it all and the being yelled at and like.
Yeah. I think an interesting thing is like when Money's study was published, I think it was called like the Joan John case.
Yeah.
Pretty sure.
Or, Jane John or something like that. But the Reimers were not named, and it was only later when David realized that his story was being used and Money's research was being used to prove Money's point that it was a nurture thing. It was a question of nurture and society that he came forward and told the story, went on Oprah and everything. Right.
Which was very brave, but I'm sure that brought up a lot of stuff too to go public like that.
Oh, sure. I mean, he wouldn't have even talked about it until like the late 90s, early 2000s. So for a solid 20 years, people were kind of living with this quote unquote proven perception that you could teach gender to somebody. Which I'm sure like for people who had gender dysphoria at the time, that was like a really complicated supposed truth to come to terms with.
Yeah.
I don't know factually about like any studies that have looked at that, but I think it'd be really interesting to see like depression and like suicide rates among people with gender dysphoria between like the 1970s and now, as our understanding of it. I'm sure it was way higher, but I don't know though, because how many people even talked about it?
Yeah. I mean, it's another like interesting part is that what Money believed was like if an adult expresses like a gender identity that's not their like the gender their sex they're born in, then that's okay, and then they should pursue that other gender.
Right.
And yet in this case, I'm trying to wrap my mind around it. Kind of, it's like he almost did the opposite of what he was.
I've
preaching.
seen people quote this case as anti-trans sentiment as well, kind of twisting it, saying like, "Oh, see, they tried to transition this kid and it didn't work, so obviously that doesn't work." And I was like, well, no, I think
so far from.
Yeah, I think we're missing the point here. Is like, it's not that. I mean, one, you shouldn't force anyone to transition, and there's this like ongoing lie in the media now in certain right-wing sections of the media. The doctors are forcing children to transition, and that's just one, blatantly untrue, and two, that's a completely different thing that we're talking about. Like, we're not talking about they took somebody who wanted to transition, who felt that they weren't identifying with the gender that they are being. How do you word this? We're not talking we're not talking about a man who doesn't feel like a man and saying, I think I identify more as a woman, and undergoing that process consensually. We're talking somebody who felt like they were a man, was forcibly transitioned to female, and then was like, whoa, this doesn't make sense. I don't feel this way. Like, we're talking about imposing a gender on somebody. Yeah. And not the surgery. Like, ignore the surgery, ignore all that stuff. Just talk about the imposed gender. And that's where that like this proves that trans isn't real falls apart, because when you take somebody who is trans and you impose a gender on them and they don't identify with that, that's exactly what happened here, and you can see the negative effects that has.
Yeah,
am I making sense? Did my argument come around in the end?
I think in a roundabout way. Yeah. Yes.
I tend to ramble, but
no, definitely. I think it's completely wrong to take David Reimer and say, look, this is any sort of anti-trans story.
Right.
He was born male. He identified that way strongly, and any attempts to change that just didn't work.
Right.
And so you can definitely draw parallels with someone who is maybe, born in the wrong body and how strongly that sentiment is to them, and then their desire to change. And he didn't have any choice in the matter until later in his life. So
yeah, you can't extrinsically change somebody's impression of themselves and how they feel and how they identify. And when you try and do that, it causes a lot of problems to their mental health, to just every component of their life.
Right. I'm trying to find this. Let's see. This person said, who I think, she wrote a biography. Money's position on the trans person was, I think, brilliant. He believed that if you were biological male and believed yourself to be female, then it was an idée fixe. It was so important to you as a person that could not be contradicted, which is interesting. I mean, that's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. It's just so the opposite of what seemed to happen in this case. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like he just wanted both things to be true.
I guess in a way that does make sense, because he, defined gender role and gender identity. So I think he saw that there was like, those were different things. And I guess that comes back to the first point one of the first points you brought up about, like, one of the reasons why these twins were fascinating to him was because they were so young. And he thought that was a opportunity to mold them one way or the other before society, got in.
But yeah, I mean, because like I said, there's no way he could have ethically ever done child experiments until this, seemingly for him, golden opportunity landed in his lap. But then, he kind of ended up just proving the opposite of his own point, that you can't teach somebody their own gender.
Yes, it's something more interior. Yeah. I did find a quote, let's see, from the Intersex Society of North America, and they kind of wrote about the case and everything. And they said, The case of David Reimer has been used by the proponents of the gender is born nature theory as proof that they are right. We like to point out that what the story of David Reimer teaches us most clearly is how much people are harmed by being lied to and treated in inhumane ways. I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah.
Part of the great harm of this case was that he was lied to.
Right.
And then that he was put through this thing with this doctor. And that the trauma of that was like just compounded everything else that was also going on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you even see that again with his brother who was put through a lot of stuff as well. And yeah, I don't know. Overall, it's a really just heart-wrenching story. It's very sad.
It is. It's tragic. But it also like you said, you know, it's important like now,
right.
This kind of story as we have these discussions about gender and sex and we navigate those things as a society.
Yeah, I know a few people who fall on the more conservative end of the line. Surprise, I'm liberal. And we've had those, one of them, I won't name them or my relationship to them, but one of these people said to me that being trans is a mental illness. And I immediately had to be like, no. I said, if you want to get technical about it, gender dysphoria is a mental illness. But that doesn't mean that that person is crazy, because mental illness is not, it's so much more complicated than that. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, if you have ADHD, if you're bipolar, it doesn't make you crazy. Gender dysphoria doesn't make you crazy. It just means that you don't feel comfortable. So to me, and if I'm wrong on this, I'd love for somebody to correct me. But to me, gender dysphoria is the condition, and transitioning is the solution or the treatment to that condition. Like if you're depressed, you can take antidepressants, but you can't really take like make me feel like a man pills. But you can transition and you can present yourself the way you want to be seen. And I think that's really, really important for people. And so it pisses me off when people say like trans people are mentally ill, because it's like they're not. It's so much more complicated and nuanced than that. And we just need people, just let people be happy and let people do the things that make them happy, as long as no one else is getting hurt from it.
You know, I feel like I can't really speak well on the trans experience or like at all, but I did read this. I feel like I'm always bringing up like books that I read.
That's fine.
This one for I think it's called We Both Laughed in Pleasure, but it's about a woman who transitioned to be a man in the 70s or 80s. And it was like a really fascinating, it's their journals, published journals. And like, it was a really fascinating educational book for me to read. So I thought it was great. And I'm giving it a plug here.
Yeah.
To check that out, because I thought it was just like being in someone's head like that helped like inform my understanding of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's why representation is so important in media and things as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? One of the worst things I heard recently was somebody say, every time I see pronouns in somebody's email, it makes me roll my eyes. I was like, why? Why? Oh, God forbid we treat people kindly, you know?
It's so funny because when I went to college, which was like 10 years ago at this point, but I went to a very liberal college, and you started every class by saying your pronouns. Yeah. And that was before like everyone else started to, I guess. But now like I go to a running club and we all start by she, her, he, him, whatever. Like we all go around in the circle and like say it. And I mean, it's Brooklyn, so like,
sure,
you know, whatever. But
I mean, why not? Right? Like it doesn't do you any harm to announce your pronouns or to know what somebody else's are. It all just comes down to like treating people with respect and dignity. And like for some reason, some people cling so strongly to the idea that we can't do that because of traditional values.
Right.
And I think that's BS.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're in a very interesting time at the moment where these ideas are changing a lot and changing quickly, or maybe not even changing quickly, but just getting more
prominent
airtime than they used to. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's hard. I mean, change is hard for people, and they react often aggressively against it. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know where to end with this one.
I know it's hard because it's like, and that was a really sad story.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, if you pull any lesson out of it, it's just treat people kindly. Don't force your whatever it is on somebody else. Your religion, your personal beliefs, your opinions of their identity. Like we're all
on this big floating rock through space together. So let's just try and make the best of it.
There we go. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I mean, we have a couple different posts about David Reimer up on the site now, which goes into a little bit more of the story there. You can learn a little bit more about it at allthat'sinteresting.com. Mm-hmm. We also have a newsletter up on the website. We're constantly publishing new stuff.
You can join our newsletter by going to allthat'sinteresting.com/sign-up or becoming a member at allthat'sinteresting.com/membership.
Yes. You can also write in to us. We actually, did you get the email? We actually got someone who wrote in last time.
We did?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Kit sent it over to me. I'll forward it to you. It was because I brought up having ADHD on it. And somebody wrote in to say like that they appreciated us talking about it openly and not like it's some taboo thing, which I thought was very nice.
That's cool.
Yeah. So, if you want to write in, you can do that at podcast@allthat'sinteresting.com. Let us know your thoughts on this episode, this new format we're trying. If you have experience that you can relate to this and you want to share, that's like, we'd love to hear it.
Definitely. And if you would rather call in, you can also do that. We have a voicemail box set up and you can call at 929-526-3029. I think we'd love to hear from people.
Yeah, always good to get new opinions and experiences and perspectives on everything we talk about here. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, until next time, thanks for listening. Recommend this podcast to your friends. Give us the old 5-star rating, leave comments, all that social media jazz.
All that jazz.
Yeah. Find us on TikTok at Real History Uncovered. All the, usual marketing stuff there at the end to wrap it up.
Yeah. Yeah. All we want is for you to say hello.
Yeah.
We would love that.
Yeah. Just pop in, say hello.
Yeah. Pop in, say hello. And until next time, I can't remember what it's not the Olympics.
It is the Olympics. The 1904 Olympic Marathon.
I have to say it's a much more lighthearted story than today's show.
It's sort of the one after that. The one after that's the exploding whale.
That's right. I'm lighthearted except for the whale.
It was already dead when it washed up.
Still.
So it's not like they killed the whale.
All right. Cool. Well, we'll talk to you next time for those podcasts.
Ta-ta for now.